It started with what seemed like a simple favor, just a quick check of the basement next door. But I never expected that stepping down those creaky wooden stairs would lead to uncovering decades of buried emotion. A life fractured by loneliness. And a woman who behind her polished smile was holding back an ocean of silent heartbreak. She wasn't dangerous, but she was desperate. And the day she locked me in her basement was the day everything I thought I knew about her and myself began to unravel. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name's Logan. I work freelance jobs around my small town in Vermont. Fixer-upper, odd jobs here and there. It's not the glamorous life, but I like working with my hands, and I've gotten to know most of the folks on my street. The kind of place where everyone waves at each other even if you don't know their name, where neighbors shovel each other's sidewalks in the winter, and where news spreads faster than wildfire. So when the house 2 doors down finally got a new resident after being vacant for almost a year, everyone took notice, including me. Her name was Elise. She moved in one early spring morning, driving a beat-up Jeep that looked like it had seen better days. She wasn't exactly the type that drew stares. No dramatic arrival, no loud personality, but something about her posture told me she wasn't here just for a change of scenery. Maybe it was the way she kept glancing at the windows, like she expected someone to be watching. Maybe it was how she parked on the street instead of the empty driveway, like she didn't plan to stay long. She looked around 50, maybe a few years older, but carried herself like someone used to hiding in the background. I didn't officially meet her until a week later. I had just finished fixing Mrs. Callahan's leaky faucet when I saw Elise. In her front yard, struggling to carry a box of tangled garden tools, I offered to help, and she gave me a tight smile. That was the first time I noticed her eyes green, sharp, and tired, like she hadn't really slept in years. She thanked me, said she was still settling in, and that the house had some quirks she wasn't prepared for. I told her to let me know if she ever needed anything fixed. That was the end of it until 3 days later when she knocked on my door. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I had just sat down with a sandwich and some leftover soup when I heard the knock. Elise stood there in a long cardigan, hair pulled up, face flushed from the wind. She asked if I had a moment to take a look at something in her basement. Said she heard something strange scratching, or maybe rattling. I thought of raccoons or mice and grabbed my flashlight and toolkit. As we walked to her place, I asked a few casual questions: how she was settling in, if she liked the neighborhood. She answered politely but never offered much, just short replies, always ending with a soft thanks or a nod. I figured she was just private, maybe shy. I didn't press. Her house still smelled faintly of fresh paint and mothballs. She led me through the narrow hallway toward the basement door. The light above it flickered slightly. I asked if she had a switch downstairs. She said yes, on the left as you go down. The steps creaked under my boots, the kind of creak you only hear in older homes built before people cared about insulation. I took my time going down, scanning the area with my flashlight. The basement was cold and unfinished stone walls, exposed pipes, scattered boxes. Nothing unusual at first. I was halfway across the room when I heard the sound. The door closing. Not slamming. Not hurried. Just a soft click, followed by the distinct sound of the latch catching. I turned around. Slowly, Elise, I called. There was no answer. I climbed the stairs and tried the door. It was locked. At first I thought maybe it was just old. Maybe the latch slipped. I knocked, then called out again. Still nothing. I pressed my ear to the wood. Nothing but the sound of my own breathing. Something about the silence on the other side of that door made the air in the basement grow colder. I backed away and took another look around. My flashlight beam passed over an old shelving unit, dusty boxes, and what looked like an old wedding dress draped across a trunk. Something about it made my chest tighten. It's the kind of tightness you feel when you're in someone else's pain without knowing why. I wasn't scared. Not exactly. But something in my gut told me this wasn't just about a basement latch. I sat on the third step and waited. 5 minutes. 10. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Eventually, I heard her voice muted, distant, through the wood. "I'll be right back," she said softly. That's when the feeling shifted from confusion to unease. Why lock the door and then leave? I stayed there another 10 minutes before I heard the lock turn again. The door opened slowly. Elise stood there, a cup of tea in her hand, as if she hadn't just left me in her basement without explanation. "Sorry," she said. I got distracted. Thought you'd still be down there working." I stared at her, unsure what to say. I didn't want to accuse her, not yet. So I just nodded and made up something about loose pipes and possible vermin. She thanked me again, walked me to the door, and said she'd let me know if she needed anything else. As I stepped back out into the drizzling rain, I glanced back at her window. She was still standing there, watching me leave. There was something behind her eyes I hadn't noticed before. Not fear. It's not anger. Something closer to regret. I spent the rest of that day trying to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. But the truth is, it lingered with me long after I got home. I've been in a lot of basements, some dusty, some moldy, some flat-out terrifying with rusted tools and spiders the size of fists. But there was something about Elise's that felt different. Not because of what I saw, but because of what I didn't. The space felt lived in and forgotten at the same time, like a room built to hold things no one wanted to deal with anymore. The trunk with the old wedding dress especially stuck with me. It wasn't just the unexpected sight of it was the way it was draped, like someone had taken it out, stared at it for a long time, and then gave up on putting it away. That image kept flashing in my mind as I tried to fall asleep, and for the first time in a long while, I couldn't rest easy knowing one of my neighbors might be carrying more than just old boxes down there. The next morning, I went about my usual routine, fed my cat, brewed my coffee, checked my job board. I had a small repair lined up at the local library. Nothing urgent, just a loose shelf someone kept bumping into. I was halfway through tightening the bolts when I caught myself thinking about Elise again. It was frustrating. I didn't know her, not really, but she had somehow wedged herself into my thoughts. Maybe it was the way she said, "I'll be right," back, like it was a promise she had made 100 times before and didn't expect anyone to believe. Or maybe it was that flash of sadness or guilt I saw in her eyes when she let me out. Whatever it was, I knew I couldn't just write it off. When I got back that afternoon, her Jeep wasn't in the driveway. I thought maybe she'd gone out, and I was ready to let things lie. But later that evening, I saw her walking up the sidewalk, holding a paper bag from the local deli. She paused when she saw me out front, as if debating whether to say something. I nodded, casual. She nodded, back, and kept walking. That should have been the end of it, but just before she reached her door, she turned slightly and called out that she still had a couple of small things in the house if I had time later in the week. I told her sure, I had some time Thursday. She smiled softer this time and said that would be nice. Thursday came quicker than I expected. I brought my toolkit, assuming it would be something minor: leaky faucet, door hinge. Maybe the flickering hallway light I'd noticed the other day. Elise met me at the door with a tray of cookies she said she made that morning. Oatmeal raisin, still warm. I'm not proud of how many I ate before even asking what needed fixing. She seemed lighter that day. Not exactly cheerful, but like the weight she usually carried had shifted a bit to the side. She told me the bathroom sink was making a weird gurgling noise and there was a loose step on the back porch. I got to work while she hovered nearby, occasionally offering me coffee or asking questions about my other clients. Nothing intrusive, just curious, but it felt almost normal. As I worked, I noticed things I hadn't before. Framed photos on a bookshelf, Elise, with a man who looked to be around her age, both laughing with wind-swept hair on what looked like a mountaintop. Another of her and a teenage girl, arms wrapped around each other in front of a high school gym. None of the photos had recent timestamps. They looked worn, like they'd been handled too many times. I didn't ask, but I could feel their weight in the room. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. By the time I finished the porch, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. Elise asked if I wanted to stay for dinner, said she made more than she could eat. I hesitated. It wasn't uncommon for clients to offer food, and I wasn't exactly rushing home to an exciting night. Something in her voice made it feel more like an invitation than an obligation. So I said yes. We ate at her small kitchen table, the walls painted a pale yellow that glowed in the candlelight. She had made chicken stew with rosemary and warm bread from a local bakery. We talked about Vermont winters, her move from Massachusetts. How I got into handyman work after leaving a construction job in my 20s. She didn't say much about her own past, only that she had spent the last decade rebuilding. I didn't press. There was a comfort in the quiet spaces between words. I didn't want to ruin that with questions that felt too sharp. After dinner, she showed me a few old records she kept in a dusty milk crate. Said she used to dance around the living room when no one was watching. She laughed a little as she said it, like it was a memory she didn't think she was allowed to have anymore. I smiled and told her I had a record player back home, mostly used it for jazz when I was cleaning. She seemed genuinely delighted by that. I left shortly after, with a paper plate of extra cookies in one hand and the sound of her laughter lingering in my ears. But even with the warmth of the evening, something still tugged at the back of my mind. That moment in the basement hadn't disappeared. It just sat there, quieter now, but unresolved. Wondered if I should bring it up, ask her why she'd locked the door that day. But every time I imagined her answer, it didn't feel worth the risk. I didn't want to be the guy who ruined something by needing to understand it too quickly. So I stayed quiet. Over the next week, Elise and I fell into an odd rhythm. She'd wave from her porch as I walked by, occasionally call me over to look at some minor thing-a-drawer that stuck, a curtain rod that sagged. And sometimes she'd offer a slice of pie or a fresh cup of tea, and we'd sit for a while without saying much at all. It was the kind of silence I hadn't realized I missed. Silence that didn't ask anything of you but your presence. Then, one day, as I was leaving after fixing a squeaky cabinet hinge, she stopped me at the door. Said there was something in the basement again. A sound. Maybe nothing. But it worried her. I hesitated just for a second, then nodded and followed her down the hall. As I placed my foot on the first step, I felt it again, that strange sense of stillness in the air. Lee stood behind me, holding the light switch. I looked back, half expecting her to laugh it off, tell me she'd check later. But she didn't. She just gave me that same soft smile, the one that didn't quite reach. Her eyes, the descent felt slower this time, though the stairs hadn't changed. Each creak beneath my boots echoed louder, like the house was holding its breath. I carried my flashlight again, but the basement light was already on. Elise had flipped the switch before I took my first step. As the yellow glows spilled down the stairwell, I caught a glimpse of her expression come, unreadable. There was no hesitation in her movements, no sign of tension in her voice, just that quiet, composed exterior she always wore like a second skin. But something about her still didn't sit right, not in a way I could explain to anyone without sounding paranoid. I told myself I was just overthinking, that whatever had happened the first time could be chalked up to a misunderstanding or an old habit she didn't know how to break. Still, I kept my senses sharp as I reached the bottom. The air was cool and damp, as basements tend to be, but there was a different scent, to something older, muskier, like cedar wood and rust. I moved slowly, scanning the room for any signs of disturbance. There was a small water heater in the corner, a few crates stacked haphazardly along the walls, and that same trunk, still with the wedding dress, lazily draped over the lid. I didn't go near it. Instead, I focused on the pipes overhead, looking for the source of the sound she mentioned. It was quiet now, nothing but the soft hum of the furnace and my own breathing. Behind me, I heard the door close again, not locked. This time, at least not yet. I glanced back. Elise wasn't in view. I called up to her, asking if she heard the noise again, but there was no response. A few seconds later, her silhouette appeared at the top of the stairs. She didn't come down, just leaned against the doorframe. I asked if she could still hear it. She said no. Maybe it had stopped. I waited, expecting her to say more, to explain what she had heard that brought her concern. But instead, she asked if I wanted something to drink when I was done. I said sure, and she nodded before disappearing again. I stayed. A few more minutes, running checks on the pipes and tapping lightly against the metal to see if anything rattled. Nothing out of the ordinary. No mice, no raccoons, no loose fittings. I even peeked behind a few boxes just in case. Still nothing. As I turned to leave, my eyes lingered on the old trunk once more. I hadn't seen it opened, and I wasn't about to snoop, but its presence was so pronounced in that otherwise barren space that I couldn't help but imagine what was inside. Memories? Secrets? Maybe just moth-eaten clothes and dusty knickknacks. But the dress draped over it felt deliberate, like a message meant only for someone willing to read between the lines. When I climbed the stairs, the door was ajar. No locks this time. I pushed it open and stepped back into the hallway, half expecting to find Elise in the kitchen or on the porch. But she was waiting just outside the doorway, a glass of iced tea in each hand. She handed one to me, her fingers, brushing mine lightly in the exchange. It was the first time I noticed how cold her hands were. We sat in her living room with the record player going. Some soft jazz tune crackled through the speakers, old. Familiar, a melody that didn't need words to be understood. Elise sat on the far end of the couch, legs curled under her, eyes distant. I asked if everything was okay. She looked at me then, directly, and gave the smallest shrug. She said she didn't sleep well most nights. That sometimes the house made noises, and sometimes it was hard to tell which ones were real. I nodded, unsure of what to say. She wasn't asking for advice, just letting something out into the open air. I could see the lines around her eyes, the kind that don't just come from age, but from carrying silence too long. Wanted to say something comforting, something that didn't sound like a platitude. But all I could offer was my presence, and maybe that was enough. We sat like that for a while, the record ending and the needle clicking in soft repetition. Eventually, she asked if I could look at one more thing before I left a light switch in the guest bedroom that flickered. I agreed and followed her down the hallway. As I worked, she lingered nearby, watching me. Not in a suspicious or unsettling way, more like she was watching a memory in motion, like I reminded her of someone she used to know. When I finished, she thanked me again and handed me a small envelope. Inside was some cash, folded neatly, more than I expected. I tried to refuse it, but she insisted, saying she appreciated my time and that I always made her feel a little safer in this creaky old place. That word stuck with me. Safer, not safe, just safer. The implication was that the danger wasn't entirely gone. Or maybe that it never had been. As I walked home, envelope in hand, I caught a glimpse of the sky turning a deep violet. The clouds looked heavy, like rain was coming. I paused at the sidewalk, glanced back at Elise's house. Her silhouette stood in the window again, unmoving, watching. That night, sleep was harder than usual. I found myself replaying our conversations. In my head, analyzing the tone of her voice, the pauses between her words, the way she seemed both grateful and distant. There was a loneliness in her that went deeper than solitude. It was rooted in something unresolved, something she didn't want to say out loud, maybe couldn't. The next few days passed without incident. I worked a couple other jobs, kept my distance, told myself I was being overly curious. But then, late Saturday afternoon, I found a small envelope slid under my door. No return address, no name, just a single sheet of lined paper inside, written in neat, deliberate handwriting. It read, "Would you mind checking the basement again? I think something's moved." No signature. But I didn't need one. I looked out my window. Her curtains were drawn, her porch light off. Part of me wanted to ignore it, tell myself she could call someone else. But I knew she wouldn't. And I knew I'd go. There was something about the way she asked without asking that made it impossible to walk away. I pocketed the note, grabbed my flashlight again, and headed back down the familiar path toward a house that had quickly become the strangest place on the block. The door creaked open. Before I knocked, she was waiting for me in the hallway, already turned toward the basement door. She didn't speak. She just gestured, and once again, I followed. The hallway felt narrower than before, the walls closing in ever so slightly as I walked behind her. Elise didn't speak, didn't explain what she thought had moved or why she was worried. Her steps were slow but deliberate, each one a silent signal that she'd already made up her mind about what needed to happen. The basement door stood open now, the warm glow of the single bulb spilling onto the top few steps. Something in me wanted to hesitate, to ask the questions that had been building over the past few visits, but I knew she wouldn't answer not with words. She was the kind of person who spoke in gestures, in silences, in glances, in careful half-smiles. She'd been letting me into her world a piece at a time, not with explanations, but with invitations, and this was another one. Maybe the most important yet. I took the first step, and then the next, and the one after that. Each creak of the old wood beneath me sounded like a warning, but I ignored it. The basement looked the same crates, same water heater humming gently in the corner, same. Trunk still half covered by the delicate fabric of the dress that had become a permanent fixture in my thoughts. The air was cool, a little heavier than usual, with a subtle scent of old paper and damp earth. I scanned the space slowly, sweeping my flashlight from one corner to another. I saw no signs of anything having moved, no boxes shifted, no new footprints in the thin layer of dust near the shelves, no rodent droppings or chewed-up insulation. Something had been down here, it left no trace. I turned back to call up to her, but she wasn't at the door. The light at the top of the stairs was still on, but her shadow was gone. A few seconds later, I heard it again, the soft click of the door closing, followed by the metallic slide of the lock. But this time, she didn't speak. No polite excuse. No delayed return, just silence. I called out her name, tried the knob, still locked. I knocked once, then again, a little louder the second time. Still nothing. I pressed my ear to the door and listened. I couldn't hear anything beyond it, no. Footsteps, no shifting, no breathing, just silence. I stepped back and exhaled slowly, staring at the old wooden door, as if it might give me an answer. This wasn't an accident, not a miscommunication. This time, she had locked it on purpose, not because she forgot or got distracted. Something else was happening here, something I didn't understand yet. I ran my hand along the edge of the door frame, checking for a hidden latch or release, but found nothing. The door was old, solid, probably original to the house, reinforced too, not easy to break. I took a few steps down and leaned against the cold cement wall. My heart wasn't racing exactly, but I could feel its pulse, steady and aware, like my body was waiting for something. I looked around again, slower this time, letting my eyes adjust to the dim lighting. There were more boxes than I remembered. Had they always been stacked like that along the far wall? One of them was open now, lid folded back, a small stack of yellowed envelopes inside. I hesitated for a moment, then crossed the room and knelt beside it. The envelopes were unmarked, but they all had something inside, handwritten letters. Some short, some long, all on similar lined paper. The same handwriting as the note I'd received under my door. I pulled one out carefully and unfolded it. The ink had bled slightly with age, but the words were still clear. I miss your voice. In the mornings, the silence is too loud without it. I reached for another. I've replayed that day 1,000 times. If I could go back, I'd hold your hand instead of walking away. Another. I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed somewhere to put the truth. Each letter was a fragment of something unspoken, something heavy and raw and personal. A one-sided conversation with someone who was no longer here. I looked up at the trunk again. The dress. It's a faint perfume of age and memory clinging to its folds. I didn't need to open it to know what it held anymore. These were remnants of a past Elise hadn't just lived through, she was still living. In it, I sat back on the floor, letters still in hand, and tried to piece it together. A marriage, maybe, daughter, a family once whole, and then something broke. Loss, regret, abandonment. The house was full of ghost snot, the kind that rattled chains or slammed doors. But the kind that whispered through photo frames and old sweaters and handwritten apologies never sent. Still no sound from upstairs. I knocked again. Part of this. Time called out to her, told her I needed to talk. Told her I understood that something was wrong, that she didn't have to keep it all buried in this cold room. But the only reply was the hum of the water heater. I set the letters back carefully and stood. The basement felt smaller now, like the weight of her grief was pressing against the walls. I walked a slow circuit around the room, looking again for anything that might help me get out. No windows, no exterior access, just the door at the top of the stairs. Eventually, after what must have been 40 minutes though, it felt like hours. I heard movement above, floorboards creaking, a faint shift of weight. Then the lock turned. The door opened slowly. Elise stood there, her face pale, eyes swollen. She looked like she'd been crying, but she didn't speak. She stepped aside. I walked past her without a word, back into the hallway, into the warm, quiet house. I stopped once, just before the front door. I turned to her and said that she scared me, that I didn't know what this was, or what she needed from me. But I couldn't help if she kept shutting me out and locking me in. She looked up at me, lips trembling. Her voice cracked when she finally spoke. She said she didn't mean to frighten me, that she just didn't know how else to ask someone to stay. Then she said she was sorry, and she meant it. I left that night unsure if I would ever come back, unsure if I should. But deep down I knew I would. Not because of pity or curiosity, but because Elise wasn't just someone broken. She was someone trying to remember how to live with the pieces, and maybe, just maybe, I was too. The night air wrapped around me as I stepped off Elise's porch, cooler than it had been in days. The quiet hum of crickets buzzed faintly from the hedges lining the street, but it was muffled by the thoughts churning in my head. The walk home was short 2 blocks through a sleepy, tree-lined neighborhood where porch lights flickered on and off, casting shadows that danced along the sidewalks. But tonight it felt longer. My feet were heavy, my body tired, and my mind still caught somewhere in that basement, surrounded by old boxes and unsent letters, and by a woman who'd locked the door not to trap me, to keep herself from being alone. When I got home, I left the lights off and sat on the edge of my bed, the faint ticking of the wall clock reminding me how long I'd been gone. I didn't sleep much, just stared at the ceiling, eyes wide in the dark, trying to make sense of what Elise had done and what it meant. The next morning, I didn't hear from her. No note under my door, no text, no sign of movement from her windows. I kept glancing toward her house from mine, trying to catch a glimpse of her silhouette through the curtains like I had before, but there was nothing. I went through the motions of the Darren errands, checked on a few repair jobs, even tried to catch up on some reading, but my thoughts kept returning to her. I kept remembering how her voice had cracked when she said she didn't know how to ask someone to stay. It was such a raw human admission. I couldn't be angry. I had known something wasn't right from the first time I stepped into that basement. Maybe not the details, but the weight of it. And the truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about the sadness in her eyes when she finally opened that door. 2 days passed, then 3. Still nothing. I figured she needed time. She was probably embarrassed, maybe even ashamed. She'd exposed something vulnerable, something she'd probably spent years trying to bury, and I didn't want to rush her. But by the 4th day, I started to worry. It wasn't just the silence, it was the stillness. The curtains hadn't moved. Her car hadn't shifted from the driveway. The recycling bin hadn't been brought out like usual. It was subtle, but it was enough to push me into action. That afternoon, I walked over and knocked on her front door. No answer. I tried again, a little firmer this time. Still nothing. Walked around to the side of the house, careful not to seem like I was snooping. The backyard gate was latched, but not locked. I let myself in. Her garden, usually neat and lovingly tended, looked a little neglected. Some of the potted plants had wilted, and the bird feeder was empty. I peered in through the back window, but couldn't see much, just the edge of the dining table and a slice of the kitchen. Everything looked undisturbed. Too undisturbed. I hesitated before circling back to the front, where I rang the bell again and knocked once more. Still no reply. I didn't want to call the police. Not yet. Had no real reason to think something was wrong, nothing except a feeling. But I knew that feeling. I'd ignored it once before, years ago, and it cost someone I cared about more than I could fix. I wasn't going to make that mistake again. I called the neighborhood liaison officer. Not 911, just the direct line. Explained I was concerned about a neighbor, that I hadn't seen her in days, and she'd been acting strangely. The last time we spoke, the officer, an older woman named Briggs, was understanding. She said she'd swing by to do a wellness check and asked me to wait out front. 15 minutes later, a cruiser pulled up, lights off. Officer Briggs stepped out and approached the door. I stood on the sidewalk, hands in my pockets, heart thudding heavier than I expected. She knocked, called Elise's name. No answer. She tried again, still nothing. Finally, she walked around the side, just like I had. She called back to me that the rear patio door was unlocked and that she was going inside to check. I nodded. Watching her disappear into the house, what followed was the longest 10 minutes of my life. I kept imagining the worst. Elise collapsed in the hallway. Elise, unconscious in the basement. Elise gone without a trace.
Oh.
I didn't realize how tightly. I'd been holding my breath until Officer Briggs reappeared at the front door and waved me over. She said Elise was fine, physically at least. She'd found her in the living room, wrapped in a blanket on the floor, eyes red and puffy. She hadn't been eating. Said she felt off. Told Briggs she didn't mean to worry anyone. She just didn't know what to do with herself anymore. Briggs asked if I could stay for a few minutes. While she contacted a social worker from the community team, I nodded and stepped inside. The air in the house felt thicker than usual, like the weight of her sorrow had soaked into the walls. Elise looked up at me from the couch. Her voice was hoarse when she spoke, but she smiled faintly and said she didn't expect to see me again. I told her I wasn't going anywhere, not until she was okay. She closed her eyes, like she'd been bracing for the opposite. While we waited for the social worker, she spoke in fragments. Said the letters in the basement were for her daughter, letters she never sent. Said the dress belonged to her mother, who died before Elise could say goodbye. She said the basement made her feel close to them, but also haunted her. She didn't know why she locked the door that day, only that something in her panicked at the thought of being left down there alone again. She wasn't crazy, not in the way people fear. She was just grieving profoundly and for a very long time. The social worker arrived a little later. Kind eyes, soft voice. She sat with Elise and gently asked questions, offering her resources, breathing room, and the dignity she deserved. I didn't stay long, just enough to know Elise was in safe hands. Before I left, Elise stood and hugged me, not tightly, not desperately, just enough to say thank you. Just enough to say I mattered. As I walked back home, I thought about the quiet strength it must have taken for her to finally open that basement door again, not just physically, but emotionally. To let someone in, to risk the weight of being known. That night, I looked at my own house differently. Less like a fortress of routine, and more like a place I wanted to open up again. Because for all her grief, Elise had reminded me of something vital. Sometimes the most profound connection comes from simply being willing to stay. The days that followed unfolded more quietly, but not in that cold, distant way. Silence sometimes creeps into your life after something unsettling happens. It was a different kind of quiet, warmer, more aware, like everything around me had paused just long enough to allow space for healing. I went about my routines with an added gentleness, a subtle attention to detail that hadn't been there. Before, mornings felt softer. My work, though the same tightening bolts, patching drywall, adjusting wiring, took on an almost meditative rhythm. But somewhere behind each hammer tap and wrench turn was a part of me still connected to Elise, still wondering how she was holding up. If she'd gotten out of bed that morning, if she'd eaten, if she'd stepped into that garden she used to love so much. I hadn't heard from her in nearly a week, and I didn't want to crowd her. The social worker told me during that final visit that Elise had agreed to see someone regularly, someone trained who could guide her through the long shadows she'd been living with. It was a relief, but also a reminder sometimes being willing. To stay also means knowing when to step back. Still, I'd kept a note by my door, her address scribbled in the corner with a reminder to check in when the time felt right. I waited, but it wasn't easy. I realized how much I'd begun to care, not just for her safety, but for her presence. The quiet moments we shared, her glances, silences that felt full instead of empty. She had slowly occupied a space in my life that I didn't know was vacant. And now, with that space temporarily closed off, I felt it more than I expected. Then one morning, just as I was finishing breakfast, I heard a soft knock at my door. It wasn't hurried, but it wasn't uncertain either. I opened it to find Elise standing there with a small cardboard box in her hands and a look that said more than any apology could. She looked better, still tired, still pale, but there was a clarity in her eyes I hadn't seen before, a steadiness. She handed me the box, saying she found something that belonged to someone else and thought maybe I should hold on to it for a while. Inside were 2 ceramic coffee mugs, one chipped slightly at the rim, the other pristine, and a paperback novel with a cracked spine. A note was tucked between the pages. It said only, "Maybe we can start again." I didn't say anything. I just nodded, stepped aside, and let her in. We sat at the kitchen table, mugs filled with fresh coffee, steam curling in lazy tendrils above the rim. The novel rested between us like a quiet promise. We didn't talk about the basement. At first, we didn't need to. She spoke about her garden, how the rain had been kind to it despite her absence. She asked about my work and whether I'd gotten around to fixing the leak she remembered me mentioning weeks ago. It was a normal conversation, but one underscored by something deeper, a silent agreement that nothing would go unacknowledged forever. Eventually, she set her cup down and looked at me with that same clear, steady gaze. She said she was sorry. Again, not for locking the door, but for the way she'd handled it. She explained that the moment she heard my footsteps downstairs that day, something inside her cracked open. A memory, a feeling. She couldn't stop it. And when she shut that door, it wasn't to trap MIT, was to buy herself a moment of silence so she wouldn't fall apart completely. But she realized later that it wasn't fair. That even in grief, we have a responsibility to those who step into our lives with open hands. I told her I understood. That I didn't hold it against her, because the truth was, I didn't. We spent the afternoon in easy companionship, but it wasn't until the sun dipped low on the horizon that she stood to leave. At the door she paused, then turned back and asked if I'd come by tomorrow to help her prune the rose bushes out back. She said they were overgrown and needed a little care. Kind of like her, I said I would. And the next day, I did. That pruning job turned into 3 hours of quiet work, laughter, and stories about her mother's obsession with roses and how she used to sing to them in French. Elise laughed at herself for trying to do the same once and sounding like a croaky record. Her laugh was softer than before, but fuller too. That small return of light made the work feel less like a chore and more like a ritual. A kind of rebuilding, petal by petal, snip by snip. Over the next few weeks, we created a rhythm. I'd stop by for coffee or lunch. She'd ask about my projects or invite me to look at something around the house that might need repair. But we both knew the repairs weren't always about leaky pipes or flickering bulbs. Sometimes they were just excuses for connection, for presence. And slowly, our bond began to solidify. Not hurried. It's not romantic in the conventional sense, but tender and deliberate, like the folding of a paper crane. Fragile, yes, but full of intention. One day, while cleaning out her garage, we stumbled across a dusty shoebox labeled to be dealt with. Inside were faded photographs, a stack of postcards, and a few more unsent letters, ones even more raw than the ones I'd seen in the basement. She looked at them for a long time, then handed them to me, said she was done carrying them alone. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about helping someone find their way through grief. It was about building something new from what remained. About choosing to stay day after day, not because it was easy, but because it mattered. That evening we sat in her backyard under the warm glow of the porch light. The rose bushes were trimmed, the bird feeder was full again, and the night was alive with soft rustles and the distant sound of a wind chime. Elise leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes, letting the air wash over her like a balm. I asked her what she was thinking. She said, "I think I'm not scared of the basement anymore." She didn't mean the room, she meant the part of her heart where all the hurt had lived. And with those words, I felt something shift, not a grand revelation or a dramatic change, but a quiet settling of weight that had been carried too long. Sometimes, the most important doors aren't the ones we walk through. The ones we help someone else find the courage to open. The morning after Elise told me she wasn't afraid of the basement anymore, I found myself lingering in my own kitchen, longer than usual, staring out the window with my coffee going cold in my hand. There was a subtle shift in the way I moved through my day now, like the air had changed texture. It wasn't about the big, dramatic moments anymore. It was about the small ones that built quietly over time, the steady beat of something fragile, growing stronger beneath the surface. I'd begun to see how much of healing wasn't about resolution, but about redefinition of self, of grief, of connection. And Elise, whether she realized it or not, was redefining everything. Her days had structure now. She watered the garden again every morning, not just out of habit, but with the care of someone who wanted to see something bloom again. She'd picked up reading again, too, a habit she said she'd abandoned long ago when the house became too quiet to bear. Now she sat under the willow tree in her backyard, a book in her lap and sunlight filtering through the branches. Her presence less like a shadow and more like part of the landscape again. I was over at her place more often, but it was never planned or forced. Sometimes I'd bring her a sandwich from the cafe near the hardware store, and we'd eat on the porch while the wind rustled through the vines. Other times I'd show up to replace a cracked window pane or fix a flickering light. And we'd end up sitting on the living room floor, sifting through her old vinyl collection, while she told stories from her 20s. She had this way of talking about her past not with bitterness, but with a kind of wistful reverence, like it was something she'd borrowed and was only now returning. It was during one of these afternoons, while we were organizing her storage room, that she came across an old camcorder. It was dusty and scratched, the battery long dead, but when she held it in her hands, her expression shifted. She said it belonged to her late husband, Daniel, that he used to film everything holidays, dinners, even lazy afternoons in the garden. For years after he passed, she couldn't bring herself to watch the tapes. She tucked them away in a box labeled too much. That day she looked at me and asked if I'd stay and watch one with her. We set up the camcorder in the living room, connected it to an old television with a tangle of wires, and sat side by side on the couch. The screen flickered to life, grainy at first, then sharpened into an image of Elise, much younger, her hair longer, her eyes brighter. She was laughing at something off camera, her hands covered in flour, and the voice behind the lens, Daniel's, was teasing her for putting sugar in the salt jar again. She groaned on the screen, tossed a dish towel in his direction, and they both broke into laughter. Real laughter. The kind that echoed into the quiet room we now sat in. Elise didn't cry. She watched it all with a stillness that was both painful and beautiful. When the video ended, she exhaled softly and said she wasn't ready before because the silence after the laughter always felt unbearable. But now, sitting beside someone who could understand the weight of memory, the silence felt less like an ending and more like a pause. That night, as I walked home, I realized how much Elise had changed in such a short span of time. Not in the way people imagine healing. There were still hard days, still mornings when she didn't want to get out of bed. But there was movement now, where once there was only stillness. And more than that, there was courage, the quiet kind, that lives in everyday choices, like watching an old tape or pruning a rose bush, or letting someone sit beside you when your past is playing on a screen. A few days later, Elise invited me to join her for dinner. Nothing fancy, she said, just pasta and wine, and a chance to talk. I brought dessert, a slice of berry pie from the bakery near the train station, and, when I arrived, she was already in the kitchen, humming softly to herself. The table was set with mismatched plates and cloth napkins, a little candle flickering between us. We ate slowly, the conversation weaving between books we loved, music we missed, and the way the neighborhood had changed over the years. She told me about her daughter again, this time with a little more detail. Her name was Mira. She'd been an artist, a dancer full of energy and stubbornness. Elise said she used to twirl in the hallway barefoot with paint-stained hands and a laugh that could shake the house. And one day she left and never came back. Not because of anger, but because some people carry a kind of sadness that no home can hold forever. There was no bitterness in Elise's voice, only the ache of memory softened by time. After dinner, we sat on the porch with the last of the wine. The sky above us painted in streaks of indigo and gold. The air smelled like jasmine and the faint smoke of someone's distant barbecue. She leaned back in her chair and asked if I'd ever lost someone I couldn't stop looking for in crowds. I told her yes. My brother. We hadn't spoken in years before he passed. Not because of anything dramatic, just life, distance, time. I still looked for his face in bus stops and airport terminals. She nodded, not asking for more. Just understanding that kind of silence, that mutual knowing, was the beginning of something sacred. Later that night, as I was leaving, Elise stopped me at the door. She didn't say anything right away, just looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite name. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small brass key. She said it was for the basement door, not because she planned on locking me in. Again, she smiled when she said that, but because if I ever needed a quiet place to think or to sit with someone else's memories, I'd be welcome. I didn't know what to say, so I just held the key and nodded. Sometimes trust isn't a conversation. It's a gesture. That key sat on my nightstand for the next few days. I didn't use it, not because I didn't want to, but because I understood what it meant and I wasn't ready yet to step back into that room with the same eyes. But when I did, I knew I wouldn't be going alone. The key stayed on my nightstand like a quiet invitation, untouched yet ever present. Each time I passed it, a small flicker of something stirred in Manat's urgency or curiosity, but something gentler, more deliberate. Like the slow-growing trust Elise had placed in my hands was now rooting itself into my days. I didn't rush to use it, and I think that was the point. It wasn't a summons or a test. It was an offering. The simple fact that she gave it to me meant more than any locked door ever could. Life moved on around the key. The neighborhood stayed sleepy, still caught in that humid summer lull where the afternoons dragged and the crickets tuned their legs like violins by sunset. Work picked up a bit. I helped fix a collapsing stairwell on Maple Lane, rewired an attic fan for the bakers down the street, even repainted a mailbox for the Johnsons, who still left me lemonade on their porch like it was the 1950s. I found comfort in the rhythm, but no matter how busy I kept myself, Elise was never far from my thoughts. She had become part of my landscape, her quiet resilience. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was thinking. The subtle way she listened not just to what people said, but to what they were afraid to say. It was during one of those long days after I'd finished a particularly grueling job replacing water-damaged drywall that I came home to find something unusual. A note stuck to my front door with green painter's tape. The handwriting was unmistakably her, slightly slanted, neat but with a soft hesitation in every letter. It simply said, "Come by if you have time. I found something I want to show you." There was no time, no explanation, just that. I changed out of my work clothes and walked over. Her door was already ajar when I arrived, as if she'd known I'd come. She called out from the back, said she was in the basement. That was new. I let myself in, the house still holding that warm, dusky smell of lavender and old wood, and I followed her voice down the narrow stairs. The basement felt different this time, less haunted. The air didn't press against my chest the way it had before. A few boxes had been cleared away, the floor swept, a new lamp in the corner casting a soft amber glow instead of the stark overhead bulb. Elise stood near a folding table, brushing dust off an old wooden jewelry box. She looked up and smiled, not nervously like before, but with the quiet steadiness of someone reclaiming a piece of herself. She motioned for me to sit, and we settled side by side as she opened the box. Inside were tiny keepsakes, worn concert tickets, pressed flowers wrapped in wax paper, faded photographs of her as a child, with a gap-toothed grin beside her mother. She said this box was the only thing she kept when she left home at 19. Everything else she left behind. She pulled out a small, leather-bound journal and opened it to the middle, thumbing through pages filled with slanted cursive. It was her mother's handwriting, poems mostly, grocery lists, notes to herself about the weather. One entry read, "July 4th, Elise picked all the strawberries without asking." pretended not to, but her mouth was red all over. I couldn't be mad. I mean, that's what childhood is for. Elise read it out loud, and then closed the book, hands trembling just slightly. She looked at me and said it was time to stop treating memory like a locked door. Maybe the act of remembering didn't have to hurt so much if someone else was willing to carry it with her. I didn't say anything. I just reached out and placed my hand over hers, and we sat there in the flickering warmth of the lamp, surrounded by a quiet that felt more like a blanket than a burden. After that night, the basement became less of a forbidden place and more of a sanctuary. She started spending time down there again, but this time with purpose, sorting, cataloging, restoring. I helped her install shelving along one wall where she could display some of her mother's ceramics, and we framed a few of the photos from the box to hang upstairs. Each time we uncovered something new, it felt less like excavating a ruin and more like planting a garden. One afternoon, she even found a reel of 8mm film she thought had been lost years ago. We took it to a small shop a few towns over that specialized in transferring old media to digital. The man behind the counter, who looked like he hadn't left the 90s, grinned when he saw the reel and said he'd have it ready in 3 days. When we returned to pick it up, Elise was visibly nervous. The kind of nervous that made her chew on her thumbnail and tap her foot without realizing. We brought the drive home and loaded it into my laptop, both of us sitting cross-legged on her living room floor like kids about to open a time capsule. The footage was grainy, flickering with age, clear enough to recognize her father's face, her mother's smile. A backyard barbecue with paper lanterns swinging in the breeze. And there she was, at years old, arms flailing in the air, as she danced barefoot across the grass. Her laughter silent, but etched forever in the grainy film. Elise watched in silence, tears rolling down her cheeks, but she wasn't sobbing. They were tears of recognition, of reunion. When the video ended, she turned to me and whispered, "I forgot how much I used to laugh." I told her it was still in her, that spark, even if it had been buried for a while. She nodded slowly, as if she wanted to believe it. From then on, Elise started recording again. It's not on old film, but with her phone.
What?
Little things, a bee landing on a daffodil, the way the light streamed through the stained glass panel in her hallway. Even me fumbling with a rusted bolt on her back gate. She said it wasn't about preserving the big moments anymore, but the quiet ones. The ones she used to overlook. That shift changed everything. She began going for walks in the park again. It's time, not avoiding the playground where parents pushed strollers and held sticky toddler hands. She started journaling. Not about the past, but about the now, what the clouds looked like. How her tea tasted that morning, what color the sky turned just before dusk. And every once in a while she'd read me an entry, sometimes with a laugh, sometimes with a tear, but always with a voice steadier than before. By mid-August, it was like she'd stepped back into the rhythm of the world, but not as the same person, as someone new, rebuilt from memory and presence, sorrow and strength. One evening, while helping her hang a shelf in the kitchen, I asked if she had any plans for her birthday, which I'd overheard was coming up soon. She tilted her head, smiled softly, and said she hadn't celebrated in years. That it always felt like too much, too many reminders of who wasn't there. But then she paused, looked me square in the eye, and said, "But this year, I think I'd like to have a small dinner. Just me and you, if you're free." And in that moment, I realized something that had been quietly building for weeks. She wasn't just opening the door to her basement. She was opening the door to her life. The week leading up to Lisa's birthday passed with a kind of quiet anticipation that neither of us spoke about directly, but both of us felt in our bones. She didn't talk much about her plans, and I didn't pry. I sensed that this wasn't going to be some elaborate party or grand gesture. It would be intimate, intentional, and perhaps even a little emotional. I could tell it wasn't just about turning 51. It was about crossing a threshold she once thought she'd never approach again, with joy or presence. For years, her birthdays had been shadow states. She tiptoed around, moments she endured instead of embraced. But now, something had shifted. There was a lightness to her gestures as she moved through the days, a subtle kind of grace in how she swept her floors or wrote out grocery lists with a hint of a smile tucked in the corner of her mouth. Even the way she hummed soft and melodic while chopping vegetables or folding Landra felt like evidence of her return to herself. She'd asked me to arrive around 6, just before the sun would dip below the trees and bathe the backyard in that golden hour glow she liked so much. I spent the afternoon picking up a small bouquet of wildflowers from a roadside stand and a bottle of red wine that, according to the old man who sold it to me, paired well with whatever the heart was chewing on that day. I didn't really understand what he meant, but it sounded fitting. I arrived on time, flowers in hand, a little nervous in spite of myself. Her porch light was already on, and when she opened the door, I stood there for a moment, surprised by the image before me. Elise wore a simple blue dress I hadn't seen before. It wasn't flashy or youthful, but it fit her in the most perfect way, like it had been waiting for just this moment to be worn. Her silver hair was pinned loosely at the back and around. Her neck hung a delicate pendant I remembered seeing in one of the old photographs from the jewelry box. She smiled when she saw me, and it wasn't the cautious kind she used to offer. It was full, certain, and without apology. The table was already set in the backyard beneath the willow tree. There were 2 plates, 2 wine glasses, and a candle flickering gently between us. She'd cooked something herself, pasta with roasted vegetables and a hint of lemon zest. It's a kind of dish that felt both light and grounding. We sat down and ate slowly, the conversation flowing like a quiet river. We talked about ordinary things, the neighbor's new puppy, a book she'd finished, a strange dream I had the night before that involved a talking crow in a very judgmental mailbox. She laughed at that, the kind of laugh that lingered after it ended, like a song fading on a warm breeze. At one point, she reached for the wine and said she'd never imagined she'd feel this kind of peace on her birthday. That for years the idea of celebrating felt like pretending. But now, with the table set and the wine poured, she realized it wasn't about pretending at all. It was about choosing to live. To mark the day not because the world told her to, but because she could. As we ate, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the yard. The leaves above us rustled in the wind, and somewhere in the distance, a child's laughter echoed through the neighborhood. Elise leaned back in her chair and looked at the sky, then turned to me with a quiet seriousness and said, "I want to show you something tonight. Something I haven't shown anyone since." Before, I didn't ask what. I simply nodded. After we cleared the dishes and brought the wine inside, she led me to the basement again, but this time there was no hesitation in her steps. She moved. With purpose. It's like someone leading a guest through a gallery of their own healing. The room was different now, cozy. A rug had been laid down in the center. The harsh light bulbs had been replaced with soft string lights draped along the beams. It didn't feel like a basement anymore. It felt like a memory room, a space curated with care. On one wall, she'd arranged a timeline of sorts, photos of her daughter at different ages, paired with short journal entries she'd handwritten, and mounted beside them. They weren't polished or dramatic. Some were simple. "Mira's first day of school," she cried, then laughed when I gave her a cookie afterward. Others were more raw. "She didn't come home tonight. My chest feels hollow." Elise stood beside me, not saying a word as I took it all in. Then she moved to the center of the room and opened a drawer built into an old desk I hadn't noticed. Before, from it, she pulled out a folded letter, yellowed with time. She handed it to me. It was from Mira, dated nearly 20 years ago. It wasn't long. Just a few lines scribbled on hotel stationery. It said, "Mom, I'm not running from you. I'm just trying to find the version of myself that doesn't hurt so much. I'll come back when I remember how to breathe." Elise said it was the last thing her daughter ever wrote before she vanished. She'd found it tucked in the mailbox a week after Mira had left. She never told anyone about it, not the police, not her sister, not even Daniel. She kept it because some part of her believed it wasn't the end. That one day, Mira might remember how to breathe and find her way back. She told me that in all these years, this letter had been both her lifeline and her anchor. It reminded her to hope, even when it hurt. We stood there for a long time, the silence stretching comfortably between us. Eventually, she placed the letter back in its drawer and turned to me with eyes glassy but calm. She said she wasn't showing it to me for sympathy. She was showing it to me because she trusted me with it. Because I'd sat beside her in the silence, listened without fixing, and helped her fill a room with light instead of ghosts. And that night, standing in that once dark basement, I understood something I hadn't before. Love doesn't always arrive wrapped in romance or grand declarations. Sometimes it lives in the quiet presence of someone who chooses to stay, and the person who helps you carry the weight of memory not because they have to, but because they want to. We went back upstairs and sat in the living room, each of us holding a final glass of wine as the last embers of her birthday flickered into night. She didn't make a wish over cake. There was no singing, no candles, but there was peace. Yeah, and that was more than enough. Before I left, she walked me to the door and stood there for a long moment. Then, softly, she said, "Thank you for coming back that day, for not walking away." I told her I wasn't going anywhere, and I meant it. The morning after Elise's birthday, the air felt different. Not just outside, where the breeze held the first whispers of autumn, but inside me. I woke up with a sense of clarity that I hadn't felt in years. Like something that had been long buried was beginning to surface with quiet insistence. There was no dramatic revelation, no bolt of lightning or echoing moment of transformation, but there was stillness, and in that stillness, a kind of truth. Elise's presence had become a thread woven into the fabric of my life, not loud or demanding, but steady. Something had shifted between us. It wasn't romance in the traditional sense, nor was it friendship in the conventional way. It was something deeper, older, more rooted to people who had known grief, loss, loneliness, and chosen not to let it define them. We hadn't made any declarations, hadn't drawn any lines or named what was growing between us. That night in her basement had changed something. The trust in her eyes when she handed me that letter, the openness of her words, the vulnerability of sharing that final, spoken part of her past, it had all carved a place for me in her world that felt deliberate. Over the next week, we fell into an easy rhythm. I'd stop by after my last job of the day, and we'd sit on her porch as the sky bruised into dusk. Sometimes we talked, sometimes we didn't. Elise had started keeping fresh flowers in the house against small arrangements she made herself from her garden. She told me once that flowers had always made her feel like time was still moving forward, even when the days felt stuck. She even picked up an old hobby she used to love, sketching. At first, she was shy about it, only showing me quick doodles on the backs of receipts or napkins. But one afternoon she called me over to show me a full sketchbook she'd been quietly filling. It was filled with pencil drawings of everyday things, a mug of tea, the outline of the willow tree, a pair of hands mid-repaired, but each one held so much emotion in its lines. They weren't just drawings. They were moments she decided were worth keeping. One evening, I came over to help her fix the loose latch on her attic door. We ended up finding an old box tucked behind insulations, something neither of us had known was there. Inside were more letters, not from Mira, but from Elise's mother. Letters she'd never mailed, pages and pages of thoughts and apologies, and poems scrawled in that same looping handwriting from the journal. Elise read them out loud, one by one, her voice trembling but never faltering. It was as if her mother had been trying to find her, even after all those years of silence. Elise said she used to resent her for being distant. But now, reading those letters, she realized her mother had loved her fiercely just in her own, flawed way. After we finished the last letter, Elise looked at me and said, "I think some people love in silence because they were never taught how to speak their hearts aloud." That sat with me, echoed, because I knew that silence too. I'd grown up with a father who never said much but would fix your car without being asked. A mother who showed love through food and knitted scarves but never once said, "I'm proud of you." And here I was, decades later, still learning. That silence didn't mean absence, it meant someone had never been given tools to name their feelings. We spent more time together in the basement after that, not because we had to, but because it had become a space for us. We turned it into something of a creative den, half gallery, half workspace. Elise brought down a second armchair, a small table with a lamp and a rug from the upstairs hallway. I added a record player I'd found at a garage sale, and together we created a playlist of songs that felt like home. Some nights we'd sit there listening to Billie Holiday or Simon and Garfunkel, letting the music fill the spaces we didn't need words to cover. One night I asked her if she'd ever heard from Mira. She shook her head slowly and said, "Not directly. But sometimes I'll get postcards, no return address. It's just a photo of some mountain or street or a strange roadside diner. No name. Just a feeling. And I always know it's her." I asked if she ever wanted to go looking, and she said I did, for years. But then I realized maybe the best thing I could do was wait with love, not chase with fear. That stayed with me. It wasn't resignation. It was acceptance. Maybe even hope in its quietest form. One Saturday, Elise invited me to go with her to the farmer's market in the next town over. It was the first time we'd gone anywhere outside the neighborhood together, and it felt strangely like a date, though we never called it that. She wore a sun hat, the kind with a wide brim, and I joked that she looked like she belonged in an old French film. She laughed and said, "Only if the film ends with." The woman, discovering she prefers jam over men, we wandered through stalls of fresh produce, handmade candles, jars of honey, and loaves of warm bread. She bought tomatoes and basil. I picked up a small bottle of lavender oil. It was simple but lovely, and as we walked back to the car, bags in hand, she reached out and took my arm, not for balance, but for closeness. I didn't pull away. That afternoon we made lunch together in her kitchen. Praisey salad, fresh sourdough, iced tea. She played music from her phone, old jazz tunes. She said her parents used to dance too when she was a little girl. We moved around the kitchen like we'd done it 100 times, handing each other utensils without asking, laughing when I accidentally knocked a spoon into the sink. There was a moment, just as she was plating the food, when she paused and looked at me. Her expression softened, and she said, "This feels like something I thought I'd never have again. It's not just the meal, but this connection, comfort, quiet joy." I told her I understood, because I did, as the sun began to dip. Lower in the sky, we sat in the living room with tea and soft music in the background. Elise had her legs tucked under her sketchbook in her lap, and I was flipping through a book on woodworking I'd borrowed from the library. We didn't speak for a while. We didn't need to. And that's when I realized this peace, this companionship, this unspoken understanding was the kind of relationship that didn't need labels or grand gestures. It was a homecoming, a rebuilding. When I left that evening, she walked me to the porch again. The air was cooler now, the season starting to turn. As I stepped down the stairs, she called my name, and when I turned, she said, "You've helped me unlock more than that basement." I smiled, because she'd done the same for me. The turning of the season brought with it a quiet shift that neither Elise nor I addressed directly, but we both felt it. The air grew crisper, the late summer, humidity giving way to the kind of cool that lingered on your skin and made everything feel more vivid. Trees began their slow metamorphosis into golds and reds, and the sun dipped lower each day, painting the streets in longer shadows. Elise's garden, once full of bright blooms and buzzing bees, started to thin out. She picked the last of her tomatoes and tied up the drooping stalks of basil, quietly accepting the cycle of endings and beginnings. Our routines softened into something deeply familiar. I found myself at her house more often than not, sometimes helping with a small fix, other times simply sharing quiet dinners or sorting through old boxes in the basement. The house didn't feel haunted anymore, not by memory, not by pain. It had become a living space again, one that exhaled warmth and intention. We started walking together in the evenings, around the neighborhood or through the nearby trails that looped around a quiet lake. She brought a thermos of hot tea, and I carried an old camera I dug up from my own garage. I'd barely used it before, but now it felt like a way to capture these fleeting days, not for documentation, but as a reminder that stillness could be beautiful. Elise loved the camera. She'd ask me to take photos of strange tree knots, faded graffiti, a squirrel with half a tail. She'd stop and stare at the water for minutes at a time, not saying a word, and I learned not to fill the silence. We were both comfortable in the spaces between words now. One evening, As we stood by the edge of the lake watching a pair of ducks glide across the glassy surface, Elise mentioned a letter she'd been thinking of writing. Not to Mira, but to herself, a kind of reflection, she said, about the past year. I told her it sounded like a good idea, and she said she might ask me to read it when she was done. I nodded, feeling honored even by the suggestion. When we got back to her place that night, the house was especially quiet, the kind of quiet that feels intentional. She made us both a cup of herbal tea and handed me a blanket, then sat across from me on the couch with a look I recognized thoughtful, but edged with something else. She said she had been meaning to ask me something, and for a moment I thought it might be about us, about defining whatever it was that had grown between us. But instead, she asked if I'd be willing to help her do something she'd avoided for years. She wanted to visit her childhood home. It was still standing, she said, only about an hour and a half drive away. No one lived there anymore. The property had been sold but left vacant after the buyer had walked away mid-renovation. She'd kept tabs on it quietly without ever driving out. But now, after everything after the basement, the letters, the videos, the birthday, she felt ready. At least, ready enough. I agreed immediately. We planned to go that weekend. When Saturday arrived, the weather was overcast but dry. A light fog clung to the edges of the road as we drove, and Elise was quiet for most of the trip. Not tense, but deeply focused, like she was gathering herself for whatever the visit might stir. I didn't push conversation. We listened to an old folk playlist she had made, and occasionally she'd hum softly along to the tunes. When we finally pulled up to the house, a small white cottage tucked at the end of a gravel driveway, she let out a breath so slow I barely noticed it. The place was exactly as she remembered, only now faded and weather-worn. The fence had collapsed in some areas, vines crept along the porch rails, and a single shutter hung crooked beside the upstairs window. She stepped out of the car and stood still for a moment, just looking. We walked the perimeter together, the dry leaves crunching beneath our feet. She pointed out where the swing set used to be, where her father once built a birdhouse that never stayed upright, where she and her sister buried a time capsule that was probably still somewhere under the azalea bushes. The front door was unlocked, which surprised us both, but we stepped inside slowly, cautiously respectful of the space. The air smelled of dust and old wood, and the walls were stripped down to their primer in some places. Tarp still lay in. One corner rolled up like it had been forgotten halfway through a task. Elise walked slowly, her fingers trailing along the walls. She paused in what had once been the kitchen and stood silently in front of a cracked tile countertop. She whispered that this was where her mother used to hum while stirring soup, where she learned to braid her hair, where her father sat once with red-rimmed eyes after Mira had disappeared. Each room we entered held a memory, and with each one, I could see her grow lighter. It's not because it was easy, but because she was allowing herself to face it. To acknowledge what had shaped her, both the gentle parts and the ones that left scars. She found the room she and Mira had once shared. The wallpaper was peeling now, but she smiled when she saw the faint outlines of stickers they'd placed above the headboard. Mira never wanted to take hers down, even when we were too old. For unicorns, she said. Her voice trembled but didn't break. We stayed up there for a while, the two of us sitting on the dusty floor, knees drawn up, just listening to the wind creak through the broken shutters. She leaned her head on my shoulder and I placed my hand over hers. I didn't need to say anything. Eventually, Elise stood and took one last look around. Then she whispered, "Let's go," and we walked back out into the pale light of afternoon. As we drove away, she didn't look back. She didn't need to. The visit wasn't about returning to what once was. It was about reclaiming the parts of herself that had been left behind by the time we got back to her house. The sky was already softening into evening. She invited me in for dinner, and we ate leftovers in comfortable silence, the weight of the day still gently hanging between us. After the dishes were cleaned and the tea was poured, Elise handed me an envelope. Inside was the letter she had mentioned, the one to herself. She asked me to read it aloud. I opened it and began. The paper was soft between my fingers, folded neatly into thirds, the kind of care someone puts into something they've wrestled with. I glanced at Elise before beginning, catching the way her hands curled around her tea mug, her shoulders poised as if waiting for something to break free. Then I started to read. The letter wasn't long, but each word was weighted with honesty. That took its time unfolding. She'd written it in the second person, addressing herself like someone gently coaxing a wounded version back into the light. "You've survived years you never thought you would," it began. "You've carried guilt like a second spine and made space for silence when others couldn't bear to sit with it." The letter moved through reflections of pain, of things she wished she had said to her daughter and mother, of regrets that once clawed at her in the middle of the night. Now written out plainly, as if naming them made them smaller, she thanked herself for not giving up, for choosing to live when it would have been easier not to, for laughing again, for opening the door when I knocked. By the time I finished, my voice had thinned from emotion. Elise didn't cry. She simply nodded, lips pressed tightly together, and said, "I think I'm finally ready to let some of it go." That night marked something important, invisible. Turning point. I didn't ask her what she meant exactly. Didn't have to. There are certain thresholds in life we cross, not with fanfare, but with quiet resolve. And Elise had crossed one. The following days brought a soft steadiness, like the calm after a storm that had lasted years. Elise moved through her routines, with more ease, humming as she cleaned, sketching longer in the basement studio, and even calling her sister in Vermont after years of strained distance. I found myself growing comfortable in her world, the lines between our lives blurring in, the best possible way. I still returned to my own place at night, but the mornings felt incomplete if I hadn't passed through Elise's kitchen, coffee mug in hand, listening to her recount some half-dream or strange bird she saw at the feeder. Then one afternoon, as I was fixing the garage door that had been sticking for months, Elise stepped outside holding her sketchbook and a curious look on her face. She said she wanted to show me something she hadn't shared with anyone. We sat on the porch, sun dappling through the leaves, and she opened the book to a series of pages filled with drawings. They were all of me, not posed portraits, but candid moments, me sipping tea, leaning over a project, looking out the window, lost in thought. The attention to detail was startling. She'd captured expressions I didn't even realize I wore. I looked at her and she said simply, "I needed a way to say thank you." This was the only language I had left. Something in me shifted again. It wasn't just flattery. It was the realization that I had become part of her healing, not by fixing anything, but by staying, by showing up over and over again in small ways. We sat in silence for a long while, her sketchbook resting between us. I realized I didn't want to imagine my life without her in it, not as a neighbor, not as a project, but as something permanent. That night, I didn't go home, not in the way I usually did. I stayed not out of necessity, but choice. We didn't talk about what it meant. There were no declarations, just a quiet understanding that we had arrived at a new place. Side by side, the season deepened, and Elise began planning a small gathering for the holidays. Nothing extravagant, just a few close neighbors, her sister if she could make it, and perhaps even her friend from the bookstore in town. I helped her hang lights across the front porch, and we made a list of things to cook together. One evening, while going through her recipe box, she stumbled upon a small envelope tucked behind, a stack of clippings. She paused, pulling it free. It was another postcard. No return address. Just a photo of a desert landscape at dusk and 5 words scribbled in pen. "I dream of you often." She handed it to me without a word. I recognized the handwriting. Immediately Merez. Elise didn't cry. She only pressed the card to her chest, then placed it gently in the box with the others. Later that night, I asked her how she could bear the not knowing. She said because hope doesn't mean expectation. It means believing something beautiful can still exist, even if you never get to see it. Those words stayed with me in the days that followed, in the middle of small task-shopping vegetables, hammering in fence nails, adjusting the thermostat. I'd hear her voice echoing that truth, and I began to understand that Elise wasn't waiting anymore. She was living with a heart that could stretch wide enough for grief and joy to coexist, for absence and presence to hold hands. She wasn't hoping for Mira to return in the way she used to, desperate and aching. She was hoping in a way that honored her daughter's freedom, trusting that wherever she was, some part of her still remembered home. One afternoon, I came by to find Elise in the basement studio, finishing a new piece. It was different from her other sketches, bigger, bolder, full of color. It depicted the basement itself, transformed, light pouring through imagined windows, vines trailing in from the outside. And in the center, two figures seated together, their outlines soft but unmistakable. It wasn't about exact likeness. It was about feeling. I stood there quietly, taking it in, and she said, "I used to think this place would always be the darkest part of the house. Now I think it might be the heart." I reached for her hand and she didn't pull away. Later that evening, as we sat outside under the glow of string lights and falling leaves, Elise leaned her head against my shoulder and said, "I don't know where this is all going. But for the first time, I'm not afraid to find out." And I, too, realized I had stopped fearing the unknown. Together, we had unlocked something more than a basement. More than a memory, we had unlocked the quiet possibility of a new beginning. The following weeks unfolded with a peaceful steadiness, like we were both learning how to live again, only this time with more intention. Elise moved through her days with a lightness that hadn't been there before, and I found myself doing the same. It was like the heavy curtain that once hung over our lives had been drawn back, letting in warmth neither of us knew we were missing. We didn't speak much about labels or future plans. There was no grand speech about becoming a couple, no sudden declarations of love. Instead, we existed beside each other with an understanding that felt more meaningful than any title could capture. Some days I still worked my handyman jobs around the neighborhood, but Elise's place had become my second home, sometimes even my first. I'd come by in the mornings with coffee, and we'd sit on her back porch, wrapped in old quilts, watching the sunrise burn through the fog over the garden. She'd hum softly or read aloud from a worn book, and the world would fall away. One chilly morning, Elise handed me a letter that had just arrived in the mail. There was no return address, but the handwriting was unmistakably another postcard. For Mira. This one was different, though. Instead of a cryptic line or vague message, it simply said, "If you're still there, I think I'm ready to talk. I miss you." Elise sat still for a long time, the card resting in her lap like it might dissolve if she held it too tightly. Then she whispered, "She's alive. She's really out there." I didn't need to say anything. I just reached for her hand, and we sat there as the early light grew stronger. The silence between us filled with hope. That afternoon, Elise wrote back. She didn't know where to send it, so she wrote it anyway and tucked it into her desk drawer with the others, a quiet act of faith. Her letter wasn't about guilt or questions. It was an invitation. She told Mira that the door was still open, that the house was still hers if she wanted it, and that she had nothing to prove or explain. She wrote, "Whatever you're carrying, you can set it down here. I've made space for you." Watching her write, it was like witnessing someone build a bridge in real time, one careful, honest word at a time. In the days that followed, Elise's energy began to shift again. She cleaned with more purpose, opened windows to let in the brisk air, rearranged furniture like she was preparing the house for something or someone. She didn't say it out loud, but I knew she was readying her heart for the possibility of reconnection. Still, she didn't let hope paralyze her. Life continued, and with each day, the bond between us deepened in ways both ordinary and profound. We had started a new tradition on Sunday nights. Elise would cook a simple meal, roasted vegetables, baked fish, sometimes a stew, and afterward, we'd take turns telling stories from our past. Not just the painful ones, but the funny, awkward, and beautiful moments that had shaped us. I told her about the time I accidentally locked myself in a garage on a job site for 5 hours, with nothing but a bag of peanuts and a crossword puzzle. She laughed so hard she had to wipe her eyes. She told me about the summer she tried to be a street performer with a friend, juggling scarves in the town square, only to be chased off by a cranky shopkeeper who thought they were pickpockets. These stories, small as they were, stitched us closer together. One evening, as I was setting the table, Elise turned to me with a contemplative look and said, Do you think we met too late? I paused, not because I didn't have an answer, but because I wanted to be careful with the truth. I told her that maybe it wasn't about timing at all. Maybe it was about the version of ourselves we were when we finally met. Not the younger, more uncertain versions, but the ones who had been weathered by life, softened by solitude, made tender by grief. Maybe this is exactly when we were meant to meet, I said. She smiled in that way she did when words sat just, right in her heart. That night, we lit a fire in the living room and watched the flames dance against the stone hearth. Elise pulled a quilt around her shoulders, and I sat close enough to feel the warmth of her presence. There was something sacred in the quiet that surrounded us, not the absence of noise, but the fullness of peace. I watched her trace the rim of her teacup with her fingertip, and I thought of all the things we still hadn't said, all the chapters we hadn't written yet, and it didn't scare me. It filled me with wonder. A few days later, we received another postcard. This one was postmarked from a small town 3 hours away. It was just a photo of a river and one sentence, I think. I'm ready to come home. Elise stared at it for a long while. Then, without saying anything, she stood, walked to her bedroom, and returned with an old sweater folded in her hands. This was hers, she said. She left it behind the night she left. It gently over the back of the armchair, and I knew she was preparing for a return, no matter how uncertain. The house began to change again. Elise put fresh sheets on the guest bed. She bought flowers for the entryway table. She baked more often, saying she needed to remember the smell of warmth. I offered to repaint the front door a fresh coat of deep red. Vibrant and welcoming in, she agreed, saying it looked like the color of home. A week passed without another card, then 2. Elise grew quieter, but not withdrawn. There was patience. In her stillness now, a kind of quiet resilience that only someone who had faced deep loss could carry. I stayed close, not to distract her, but to simply be present. We returned to our walks by the lake, to our slow breakfasts, to our basement evenings, filled with music and sketches and comfortable silence. And still, she left the porch light. On every night, not out of desperation, but out of hope. It's a kind that doesn't demand anything, just waits with an open heart. Then one cold, rainy morning was a knock at the door. Elise froze. I rose and looked through the side window, and my breath caught in my chest. A woman, soaked from the rain, stood on the porch. She looked older than Elise had described, but the resemblance was unmistakable. Her eyes were the same shape, her stance uncertain but familiar. Mira? I stepped back, letting Elise walk slowly to the door. Her hands trembled as she turned the knob. She didn't say anything. Neither did Mira. But when their eyes met, something passed between them that words could never hold. Then, quietly, Elise stepped aside, and Mira stepped in. The moment Mira crossed the threshold, the air in the house shifted. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It was quiet, so quiet it felt like time was holding its breath. Elise stood motionless as her daughter stepped inside, her soaked shoes leaving small puddles on the wooden floor. Mira's coat clung to her, dripping steadily, and her eyes darted nervously around the entryway, as if trying to remember how the walls once looked, how the air once smelled. Elise didn't rush to hug her or bombard her with questions. She simply closed the door behind her and reached for a nearby towel, handing it to Mira gently. Mira took it, murmured a barely audible thank you, and wiped the water from her face and hair. There was a profound gentleness in that exchange, like watching two people learn how to be around each other again after forgetting the steps to a dance they used to know by heart. I remained in the background, unsure whether to give them space or be part of this delicate reunion. Elise glanced at me, her eyes full of meaning, and I understood without words. She wanted me there not because she needed help, but because she felt safe with me by her side, so I stayed. I quietly moved into the kitchen to make tea, giving them a moment to reacquaint, to breathe. I could hear them speaking softly in the next room. Not full sentences, but fragments. "You look different," Elise said. "So do you," Mira replied. "I didn't think you'd really come," Elise added. "Neither did I," came Myra's honest response. It was like listening to two ghosts step back into their bodies, slowly figuring out how to be flesh and feeling again. When I returned, with the tea, they were sitting across from each other on the living room sofa. Knees angled inward, the distance between them still cautious but not cold. I placed the mugs down and made myself comfortable in the armchair, ready to leave if needed, but Mira smiled faintly and said, "You can stay." Elise gave me a grateful look, and I settled in, heart pounding, as the real conversation began. Mira spoke in slow, measured words, like someone dragging a heavy suitcase through thick mud. She told us she'd been living upstate for the past few years, working at a co-op farm, trying to build a life with simplicity and space. She didn't have a phone. She didn't use social media. She'd gone off-grid, trying to escape the weight of who she had been and the guilt she couldn't seem to shake. She said she hadn't meant to vanish, not like that, but when she had, it felt impossible to come back. The longer she stayed away, the harder it became to imagine returning. She carried the shame of walking out that night, of not saying goodbye properly, of sending postcards she never expected Elise to keep. "I thought I was broken," Mira admitted, "and I didn't want to drag that into your life again." Elise listened with such stillness that I could see her restraining 1,000 emotions. When Mira finally paused, Elise reached out and placed her hand over her daughter's. "You were never broken," she said. "Just lost. And we all get lost." That was when Mira began to cry real, open, collapsing tears that shook her shoulders. Elise moved beside her and wrapped her arms around her, cradling her like she was 5 years old again, rocking her gently without saying a word. That night, we didn't talk much more. Mira was exhausted, and Elise prepared the guest bedroom, placing fresh linens and the old sweater that had waited patiently on the chair. Mira changed into dry clothes Elise had saved, and once she was tucked in, the house fell into the kind of quiet that felt holy. Elise and I stood in the hallway afterward, both of us overwhelmed in different ways. She leaned into me, her forehead against my chest, and whispered, "She came back." I wrapped my arms around her and held her there in the dim light, knowing that not all returns come with explanations. Some just need acceptance. We stood that way until the house felt still again. Then I walked her to her room and kissed her. Good night. The next morning, Mira joined us for breakfast, still quiet but more present. Elise made pancakes and sliced fruit, and we ate in a soft rhythm of shared glances and cautious laughter. Myra asked if the basement still looked the same, and Elise nodded. She didn't press. Later, Mira walked down on her own and stayed there for a long time. When she emerged, she was holding one of the charcoal sketches Elise had drawn, the one of the basement transformed, filled with imagined light and green vines. "You saw this place differently than I did," she said. Elise smiled and told her, "That's because I started seeing it with less fear." Mira nodded, folding the sketch gently and asking if she could keep it. "Of course," Elise said, tears pooling behind her lashes. Over the next few days, Myra stayed. Not forever, not yet, but long enough for walls to soften. We learned her favorite meals, the way she still stirred her tea 5 times before drinking it, how she hummed to herself when nervous. She began sketching again, on the back of old receipts, napkins, anything she could find. Elise gifted her a fresh sketch pad and a set of pencils she had bought years ago but never used. Watching them draw together at the kitchen table was like watching time fold in on itself, like the house was reclaiming something sacred. One evening, Myra asked if we could all go for a walk by the lake. It was quiet that night, the sky bruised with violet and gold. And Mira walked between us, her hands deep in her coat pockets, her breath fogging softly in the cool air. "I used to dream of this," she said, "coming back and not feeling like a stranger." Elise squeezed her hand, and for the first time in years, I saw hope light up Mira's eyes. Later that week, Mira told us she planned to return to the farm, but would come back soon, maybe even stay longer next time. Elise nodded, not clinging, not pleading, just grateful. Mira hugged us both before she left, this time with bags packed, a phone number scribbled on paper, and a long embrace at the door. As we watched her walk down the driveway, Elise didn't cry. She stood tall, her face full of quiet pride. This time, she said, she didn't disappear. She just left. And that made all the difference. In the weeks after Mira's departure, the house carried a different kind of silence. Not the heavy, aching one that used to seep into the walls, but a calm, settled quiet, like the whole place had finally exhaled. Elise moved through her days with a kind of grace I hadn't seen before, a slow and steady rhythm that spoke of peace rather than waiting. There were no more nightly glances at the mailbox, no more questions left hanging between us about weather. Mira would reach out again. Because now, for the first time in years, Elise had something solid to hold on to, a moment of connection that wasn't imaginary or hoped for, but real, lived and witnessed. And that had changed everything. I spent most of my time at Elise's house now, though I still kept my apartment across town. We didn't talk about merging our lives officially, but the merging had already begun in quiet, habitual ways. My tools lived in her garage. My toothbrush sat in the cup beside hers. Shopped together, cooked together, fixed things together. Sometimes we slept in the same bed, sometimes not, and there was no pressure either way. It felt good right too. Let the connection breathe and grow without having to force it into a specific shape. There were days when we barely spoke, each absorbed in our own quiet thoughts or work, but even in the silence, there was companionship. Not the kind that fills space with noise, but the kind that softens the edges of solitude. One evening, we were sitting on the porch swing as dusk fell over the neighborhood. Elise had a sketch pad on her lap, and I was sipping chamomile tea, the kind she insisted helped with sleep. She looked up from her drawing and asked, almost casually, if I'd ever thought about leaving town, just packing up and starting fresh somewhere new. I turned the idea over in my mind, considering it more seriously than I expected. I told her I had, at different points in life, but it never felt like the right time. And now, I added, with a glance in her direction, I didn't feel the need. She smiled, a soft, appreciative curve of the lips, and returned to her drawing. A long pause stretched between us before she said, "Sometimes I think this town kept me stuck. But maybe it was never the place, it was the weight I carried inside it." The next morning, she surprised me by suggesting we go on a road trip. It's just a weekend getaway, somewhere quiet and green where we could walk trails and forget time. So we packed light books, snacks, a blanket and drove north into the hills. Following a winding road through small towns and thick trees, we didn't plan much. That was the point. The spontaneity of it felt freeing, like we were reclaiming something that adulthood had long stolen from us. We stayed in a little cabin by a lake, the kind of place that had no Wi-Fi and only one diner in town. The air smelled of pine and old earth, and at night the stars pressed close like they were listening in. We cooked over a small fire pit, burned marshmallows on purpose, and fell asleep with the windows open, the sound of crickets filling the space between our breaths. On the second day, while hiking a narrow trail that wound through a grove of maple trees, Elise paused to catch her breath and looked back at me with a glint in her eye. "Do you ever wonder," she said, "if we would have found each other in another life?" I didn't answer right away. I thought about it as we kept walking, letting the crunch of leaves underfoot fill the space between us. Finally, I said, "I think we would have, but I'm glad we found each other in this one." She didn't say anything in response, but later that evening, as we sat by the fire, she reached over and rested her head on my shoulder. It wasn't a question, it was an answer. When we returned home, everything felt a little different. Not because the house had changed, but because we had. Elise walked through her door with the ease of someone who knew she belonged there, not just physically, but emotionally. She wasn't waiting for anything anymore. It's not a phone call, not a knock at the door, not a reason to feel whole. She had built something out of the ruins, and she had done it gently, piece by piece. I watched her move through the kitchen, humming softly, and I realized just how far she'd come from the woman who once locked me in a basement out of fear and pain. Now there was nothing hidden, nothing buried, just a life unfolding at its own pace. Mira continued to write, sometimes by email, sometimes a postcard. She was rebuilding her life too, in her own way. Elise never pushed her to come back right away. She simply replied with honesty and love, always leaving the door open. And Mira responded, slowly but steadily, sending photos of the farm, stories of her animals, even a rough sketch of a sunrise she'd captured one morning after a long night of planting. Elise framed it and hung it in the hallway, across from one of her own. Side by side, she said, like we're stitching the family back together, one picture at a time. The basement, once a place of ghosts, had become something entirely new. Elise converted it into a small gallery, open by appointment to local artists and friends. She called it The Quiet Below, a nod to the silence that had once filled it, and the peace that now lived there. People came and lingered, drawn to the warmth and the honesty of the space. Some stayed to talk, others simply sat in the corner, sipping coffee, soaking in the stillness. It became a haven not just for Elise, but for anyone who needed to breathe. And me? I kept building, fixing, showing up, not just at Elise's house, but in the community. I started offering classes at the community center: how to patch drywall, how to build a table, how to take care of your home with your own two hands. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was meaningful. It gave me a sense of purpose that I hadn't known I needed. And every evening, I came back to Elise's, where the lights glowed warm and the air smelled like lavender and wood smoke. One day, as I was tightening the hinges on her garden gate, she stepped out onto the porch, holding 2 glasses of lemonade. She handed me one, leaned against the post, and said, "You know, I never asked what you were doing the day I called you to check the basement." I chuckled, taking a sip. Honestly, I was about to drive out of town for good. Had the truck packed and everything. She raised an eyebrow, surprised. What stopped you? I looked at her, really looked at her, the light in her eyes, the steadiness in her frame, the way her presence grounded me in ways I still couldn't explain. And I said, "You did?" She smiled, not with triumph, but with a quiet kind of gratitude. And in that moment, we both understood the basement may have been the beginning of the story. But the life we were building now, that was the heart of it. As summer eased into early autumn, the rhythm of life between Elise and me found a deeper stillness, a gentler current that carried us along without urgency. The trees along our street began to shift in color, exchanging their deep greens for gold and crimson, and the breeze in the afternoons cooled just enough to warrant sweaters and warm drinks. Elise took to sitting outside more often, bundled in her favorite shawl, sketching the slow change of the landscape around us. I joined her whenever I could, bringing coffee or cider, sometimes tools if there was something small that needed fixing, though more often than not, I just stayed for the quiet. The house itself seemed to settle too, no longer carried the creaks of unrest or the tension of old stories buried beneath its floorboards. Instead, it felt lived in and light, filled with little signs of a life reshaped with care. The once shadowed basement now welcomed visitors weekly, people who had heard whispers about the woman who turned her pain into beauty and opened her home to others wanting to do the same. Sometimes I stood in the corner while they came and went, watching their faces soften in the glow of Elise's artwork, their shoulders ease under the weight of her quiet compassion. No one left unchanged. Mira's messages grew more frequent longer. Emails, photos of her progress on the farm, voice notes where her voice no longer trembled with uncertainty. It was clear she was healing, not in a straight line, but in a way that was real. Elise never expected more than what Mira was able to give, and I think that made all the difference. One Sunday afternoon, a package arrived. It was from Mira. Inside was a small, hand-bound book of sketches, some of landscapes. Some of faces, one unmistakably of Elise, sitting on the porch swing with a soft smile and distant eyes. Elise stared at it for a long time before she held it to her chest and whispered, "She remembers me as I was." I said nothing, just placed a gentle hand on her back and sat beside her while she cried. As the weeks passed, the air grew crisp, and our walks became shorter but no less meaningful. One evening, we wandered down to the lake just as the sun was beginning to set. The water shimmered with streaks of gold and violet, and Elise reached for my hand as we stood at the edge, watching the ripples stretch toward the horizon. After a while, she turned to me and asked something she hadn't before. "Do you ever wish things had turned out differently? We met younger, or had more time?" I thought about it, about all the years we hadn't shared, about the versions of ourselves that never collided, the moments we missed before we ever knew each other existed. Then I shook my head. No, I said, because those years made us who we are now. And I wouldn't trade this version of us for anything. She nodded, her eyes misty but steady, and squeezed my hand in silent agreement. We didn't need a future mapped out to feel certain anymore. What we had wasn't fragile. It had been tested, stretched, even broken at times, and it endured. That was enough. Still, there were conversations we hadn't yet had. One night over dinner, Elise brought up the idea of me moving in permanently. She said it without ceremony, placing her fork down and looking at me with that clear, open gaze. She had, "You're already here more than not," she said. "We've built something good, and I want to share it fully." I reached across the table, took her hand, and told her yes. Not just because it made sense, but because it felt right in the deepest part of me. We spent the next week rearranging the house again. I cleared out my apartment, bringing over the last boxes of tools and books, old photo albums, small things. That had meaning. Elise made space for them without hesitation. Her home, once filled with echoes of the past, now had room for new stories, for laughter, for memories made in the present. We painted the walls of the guest room together, even though neither of us was especially good at it, and ended up with streaks of pale green across our clothes and faces. We laughed so hard we had to sit on the floor just to catch our breath. It was one of those ordinary moments that somehow felt like everything. As fall deepened, we hosted a small gathering to celebrate the new chapter. Nothing grand, just a few neighbors and friends who had supported Elise through her hardest times. We lit candles, baked pies, and filled the house with music. Myra didn't attend, but she sent a bouquet of dried wildflowers and a handwritten note that said, "For the life you're growing now, I'm proud of you, Mom." Elise placed it on the mantel right next to a photo of the three of us, taken just weeks before, arms slung around each other, smiling into the sun. Later that night, after everyone had left and the house had quieted again, Elise and I sat on the porch in silence. The air was crisp, and the stars were bright above the treetops. She leaned her head on my shoulder and said, "I never thought I'd get to feel this again. Safety, joy, belonging." I kissed the top of her head and told her, "You didn't just find it. You made it." She looked at me, and in her eyes was a kind of peace that had taken a lifetime to earn. And somewhere deep in that stillness, I realized that while the story began in a dark basement where fear and memory tried to keep her buried, it found its light in the everyday shared. Meals, soft mornings, quiet hands reaching for each other in the dark is the real rescue. Not me unlocking a door, but us opening new ones together. The following weeks passed in a gentle rhythm, like a song that didn't need words to be understood. Elise and I had settled into something deeper than routines, something unspoken and enduring. Mornings were slow, filled with the scent of fresh coffee and the rustling of newspaper pages. She liked reading with her legs curled under her, wearing oversized sweaters and socks with frayed heels. I'd take the first sip of her cup when she wasn't looking, and she'd always pretend to be annoyed. The days themselves weren't always special, just errands, repairs, conversations with neighbors, but they felt meaningful in their simplicity, the kind of days I once thought belonged only to other people. One crisp morning, Elise was outside, trimming the overgrown hedge while I organized tools in the garage. We were a few weeks into October, and the trees had become a mosaic of fire and honey. The sun cast long shadows across the yard, and somewhere down the street, kids were laughing. As they kicked leaves into the air, Elise called out to me, asking if I remembered the old wooden bench she'd stored in the basement years ago. I did. It had been gathering dust in the far corner, almost forgotten. She said she wanted to restore it, place it under the elm tree, out front, the one that turned a deep gold each fall, its branches bowing gracefully toward the earth. That afternoon, we brought the bench up. The wood was still sturdy but worn, with chipped paint and rusted bolts. As we worked side by side, sanding and repainting it, Elise told me stories I hadn't heard before about the first time she'd bought the bench when Mira was still a toddler, how they used to sit on it after school sharing juice boxes, how one day Mira had etched her initials into the side without permission and swore it wasn't her. We both laughed at the memory, and when we finally reassembled it and placed it beneath the tree, It felt like returning something sacred to its rightful place. We sat there for hours, the sun dipping low behind the houses, long golden beams cutting. Through the thinning leaves, Elise rested her head on my shoulder, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing circles on my wrist. "I don't think I ever let myself picture this," she said softly, not the house feeling full again, not love without. Fear not being seen, really seen, without needing to hide first. I turned slightly, kissed the top of her head, and replied, "You didn't need to picture it. You just needed to live through enough storms to recognize the calm when it finally came." There was a softness to her those days, but also strength. She had started teaching weekend art workshops in the basement gallery. At first, just a handful of women came, older, quieter, unsure, but as word spread, more arrived. Some were widowed, some divorced, some simply lonely. They didn't all come to paint. Some just came to sit, to be around others without expectation. Elise called it her quiet circle. I watched her lead them with tenderness and quiet confidence, guiding their hands when needed, encouraging them when their doubt crept in. There was healing in that space, not just for them, but for Elise too. Every brushstroke, every shared story was a stitch in the fabric she'd been mending since the day I first stepped into her life. One evening, as we cleaned up after a session, one of the women, Janine, a widow in her 60s, pulled me aside. She'd always kept to herself, barely speaking beyond greetings. She said, "I just want you to know, whatever you did for her saved her." I started to protest, to tell her it wasn't me, that Elise had done the hard work. But Janine shook her head. "No, sometimes it takes someone staying long enough to show us we're worth the love when you stayed." Her words stayed with me for days. Around mid-October, Mira sent a surprise message she wanted to visit for Thanksgiving. Elise reread the message at least a dozen times, her fingers trembling each time she held the phone. She didn't reply. Right away. She didn't want to scare Mira off, didn't want to press. Eventually, she simply wrote, "I'd love that. Come as you are. Bring whoever you are now." Then she put down the phone and stood quietly by the window, her eyes scanning the sky like she was searching for a sign. I walked up behind her, wrapping my arms around her waist. And she leaned back into me, whispering, "I think we're finally getting her back." I whispered, "No, she's coming home on her own." In the days leading up to Thanksgiving, we decorated the house. Not extravagantly, just warm candles, dried leaves on the mantel, a handmade wreath on the door. We baked together, making Elise's family stuffing recipe and an apple pie from scratch. Even though the crust ended up lopsided, Elise found herself humming more often, lost in thought, sometimes stopping mid-motion to smile softly to herself. I asked her once what she was thinking about, and she said, "How the same walls that once felt like they were closing in now feel like they're opening up." That night, I stood outside alone for a while, watching the windows glow from within. The house had changed, yes, but more than that, it had been reclaimed. Not just by Elise or Myra, but by all the moments we'd stacked on top of pain to build. Something new. I thought about the day she'd locked me in the basement, how wild, how desperate it had felt. And yet, from that lowest point, something miraculous had begun. Love, yes, but also redemption, transformation, the slow, aching climb back to life, and it was far from over. The day Mira was set to arrive felt like standing at the edge of a long-awaited tide, calm, hushed, and brimming with a weight that only those who've waited years can truly understand. Elise was quiet all morning, not from nerves exactly, but from something deeper, a reverence, maybe. She moved through the house with deliberate care, adjusting picture frames, straightening throw pillows, checking the roast in the oven, even though it still had hours to go. I didn't hover. I simply watched her work, knowing full well that this wasn't about preparation. It was about reclaiming something that had once felt lost. I spent most of the afternoon outside, raking leaves while Elise remained inside preparing food, playing music softly, a mix of old jazz and instrumental pieces she used to listen to when Myra was young. Every now and then, I'd hear her humming, then pause, as if the melody carried too many memories to finish. As I piled the leaves, by the curb, a breeze picked up, scattering some back across the lawn. I smiled to myself. It didn't matter. Some things, like love and grief, would always be unruly. By 4 in the afternoon, sky had begun to darken into that soft November blue, and Elise stood by the front window, her fingers absently twirling. The cord of the curtain. I came in quietly and set a hand on her shoulder. She didn't look at me, but she whispered. She said 5. She's usually late, but what if I gently squeezed her shoulder and said, then she's coming. That's all that matters. At 5:14, a car pulled into the driveway. Elise didn't rush to the door. She didn't pace or gasp. She simply straightened her spine, smoothed the front of her sweater, and opened it slowly. Mira stepped out of the car, alone, holding a small overnight bag and a bouquet of wildflowers in one hand. Looked older, of course, more lines around the eyes. Her hair shorter now, sun-kissed, but there was something unshakably familiar in her gaze. A kind of stubborn hope, the same one I'd seen in Elise countless times before. They stood there for a moment, staring at each other, neither one speaking, like the years between them needed to catch up first. Then finally, Mira crossed the space between them and wrapped her arms around her mother. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was quiet and long and trembling, and it said everything. I stayed back for a while, giving them space, until Elise turned and gestured me forward. Mira looked at me with cautious eyes, then softened as she stepped toward me and extended her hand. You're a Roman, she said. I smiled and nodded. And you're Myra. I've heard a lot about you. She nodded too. I've heard about you too. Thank you. That was all she said. That was enough. Dinner was warm and imperfect. The potatoes were a little overcooked, the green beans slightly cold, but no one cared. We ate by candlelight, passing dishes and memories back and forth. Mira shared stories about her farm, the chickens she raised, the storms she endured, the quiet mornings that reminded her of childhood. Elise listened, wide-eyed, absorbing every word as if it were scripture. Occasionally, she'd offer a small detail from the past, like, you always used to hum when you painted, or your favorite toy was that wooden horse from the flea market, and Mira would blink, surprised, then laugh or nod in recognition. It wasn't a floodgate. It was a steady drip of reconnection, of memory meeting presence. After dinner, we sat by the fire in the living room. Mira ran her fingers along the edge of the mantel, pausing when she saw the note she'd once written, the one she'd sent months earlier with the drawing of the sunrise. Elise had framed it. Mira touched the glass, then turned and said, You kept this, Elise? Just nodded. Mira sat down beside her and leaned into her side, not quite like a child, but not fully separate either. I watched the way their silhouettes curved into each other, like two pieces of a puzzle finding home again. Later, as the fire dwindled and the room grew darker, Mira turned to me. You were there when she needed someone, she said. I left. I shook my head gently. You came back. It matters just as much. Elise reached for her daughter's hand and said, We all did what we could with what we had. The important part is this right now. Mira stayed for 3 days. Didn't talk about everything, and they didn't need to. Some wounds don't need to be reopened to be healed. They gardened a little, cooked together, watched old movies late into the night. Mira and I even sat outside on the porch once while Elise napped. She asked me what it was like being with her mom. I told her the truth. It was honest, sometimes hard, always worth it. She smiled faintly and said, She was never that open with anyone when I was a kid. I always thought she was made of steel. I chuckled. She still is. But now she lets you see the softness underneath. Before Mira left, she handed Elise a wrapped package. Inside was a framed drawing of the house. But not as it had been, as it looked now. Lush, warm, alive. Elise touched the frame and whispered, You saw it. Mira nodded. I saw you in it. When the car pulled away, Elise stood on the porch for a long time, the wind teasing her hair. She didn't cry, she didn't waver. She turned to me and said, I think we're going to be okay. I said, We already are. That night, as we curled into each other beneath thick blankets, the wind howling gently outside, I thought of the basement of where the story had started. A locked door, a broken woman, a man who stayed. But this was the real story. Not how we met, but how we remained. How healing came not all at once, but one moment at a time, through forgiveness, through presence, through love that didn't demand perfection. And somewhere in that quiet, I knew the rest of our life would be made of these same threads, soft, sturdy, and endlessly woven. Autumn lingered a little longer than expected that year, as if the world itself was giving us more time to appreciate what we had found. The trees clung stubbornly to their remaining leaves, and the sunlight slanted through the windows just a little warmer than it should have for mid-November. Elise and I had settled into something even deeper than before, less about romance, more about companionship that ran bone deep. We no longer needed constant conversation. The silence between us had grown comfortable, meaningful even. A hand on a shoulder, a glance over coffee, a shared laugh over a burned omelet. Those moments told our story better than words could. The basement, once a place of fear and retreat, had blossomed into something remarkable. Elise had expanded her workshops into 2 sessions per week. People came not just from our neighborhood anymore, but from neighboring towns as well. Word had gotten out about the woman who had turned grief into something tangible and welcoming. They came for her warmth, for the permission she gave them, to feel again, to try again. Some were recovering from loss, others navigating divorce, some simply lonely souls who hadn't held a brush or pencil in decades. Elise gave them space, time, and the gentle kind of encouragement that didn't force healing, but invited it to happen naturally. One chilly Tuesday evening, after a workshop, a young man stayed behind to help clean up. He was no more than 22. Lanky, soft-spoken, with ink smudges always on his fingers. He told Elise that attending her class had been the first time he felt he could breathe in months. That his therapist had recommended something creative, but he hadn't expected to find comfort in a stranger's basement. Elise smiled and said, "It's not about the art. It's about remembering that you're allowed to feel safe somewhere." He nodded, eyes glassy, and promised to return next week. Moments like that kept stacking on top of one another, till it was no longer just a workshop, it was a sanctuary. Meanwhile, Mira's messages grew longer and more detailed. She shared photos of a new art space she was building on the pharma sunroom lined with glass and filled with wildflowers in pots. She told Elise that she'd been inspired by the basement, by the transformation of something dark into a source of light. One day she even asked if she could come visit again before Christmas, not for a long stay, but long enough to help decorate, maybe bake cookies like they used to. Elise didn't answer right away. She stared at the message for several minutes, then simply handed me the phone and said, "Would you mind replying for me?" I don't trust my hands not to shake. I nodded and typed, "We'd love that. Come home." The idea of the holidays didn't seem so heavy anymore. Last year, Elise had told me she avoided them entirely. Too many memories, too much quiet. But this year, she began collecting little trinkets of snow globe from a thrift store. Cinnamon-scented. Candles, strings of warm white lights. She said she didn't want the season to feel overwhelming. Just warm, intentional, real. We strung lights along the porch together one morning, bundled in coats and scarves, laughing as we struggled to untangle years-old wires. By the time we were done, the house glowed soft against the early dusk. Neighbors slowed their cars to admire it, some even stopping to compliment Elise on how cozy it looked. She beamed every time. One evening, as we sat by the fire, Elise asked me if I ever thought about leaving. It wasn't a dramatic question, just a quiet one, said like someone testing the edges of security. I shook my head. No, not once. She didn't say anything for a long time after that, just reached over and took my hand. We stayed that way for a long time, the fire crackling and the world outside slipping into a hush. Later that night she told me, "When I locked that door months ago, I didn't know if I was trying to keep the world out or myself in. I just knew I was afraid." I told her, "You're not afraid anymore." And she whispered, "Not with you." A week before Mira's visit, Elise decided to hang some of her own artwork upstairs in the main hallway. It was something she hadn't done before. Her work had always stayed hidden, tucked into journals or the basement walls. But this time, she framed 3 pieces, one of a tree breaking through concrete, one of a woman walking alone down a dark tunnel toward light, and one of a house with a single lit window under a full moon. I asked her what they meant. She said, survival, resilience, and finally home. We also started making small changes to the house, not renovations, just touches that made it more ours. We turned the guest room into a shared reading nook, lined the walls with mismatched bookshelves, filled it with blankets and mismatched pillows. We replaced the worn doorknobs with ones that didn't stick, and painted the front door a deep blue that Elise said reminded her of Mira's eyes when she was little. Every change, no matter how small, felt like sealing a chapter and opening a new one. We hosted a small pre-holiday dinner with just a few close friends and neighbors. Janine brought homemade cider, and our friend Louis played the piano softly. In the corner, the house buzzed gently with warmth and laughter, not loud but full. At one point during the evening, I looked around and realized that every person there had, in some way, found healing inside these walls. It wasn't just Elise who had grown. We all had. This house, once a fortress of memory and silence, had become a place people were drawn to for comfort, for connection, for second chances. After everyone had left, and we were cleaning up the last of the dishes, Elise paused and said, I don't think I knew what love really was before. I looked up from the sink. What do you mean? She dried a plate slowly, then said, I thought love was about grand gestures, fireworks, passion, but now I know it's the quiet loyalty, the everyday choosing, the way you hold my pain without flinching. I stepped forward and wrapped her in my arms. Then I'll keep choosing you. Every day. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall. The first snow dusted the ground like a quiet promise, soft, slow, and full of beginnings. The air smelled of pine and chimney smoke, and the days shortened into early evenings that wrapped the house in a gentle hush. Mira arrived 2 days before Christmas. This time, she brought her partner, a woman named Clara, who had kind eyes and a painter's soul. Elise was nervous again, but it was a different kind of nervous, like hosting honored guests, not ghosts from her past. When she opened the door and saw them standing side by side, bundled in coats and scarves, carrying a bottle of wine and a handmade ornament, Elise's whole body softened. Welcome home. The next 2 days passed. In the sort of peaceful blur that feels both fast and slow, Clara and Mira brought laughter into every room. They helped decorate the tree with Elise's old ornaments, each one a tiny time capsule of memories, Myra's preschool craft. A ceramic dove from Elise's mother, a wooden acorn, Elise said, symbolized strength during hard years. The angel tree topper Elise had made in her 20s and insisted on placing it herself. As she stretched to fix it atop the tree, Elise held the ladder steady and smiled up at her daughter, not with worry, but with pride. That night, they all played board games and drank hot cider. Mira dozed on the couch with her head on Clara's lap, and Elise, sitting beside me, whispered, I don't think I've ever felt this full. I squeezed her hand and said, that's because we're not missing anything anymore. Christmas morning was simple. Clara cooked breakfast while Mira played Christmas music from her phone. Elise and I exchanged gifts. Nothing extravagant, just meaningful. She gave me a sketch she'd done of us in the garden, side by side, backs turned, hands almost touching. I gave her a new set of brushes and a framed note that read, The world changed when you stopped hiding. She pressed her lips together, blinking back tears, and kissed my cheek softly. Thank you for waiting for me, she said, for not rushing me into healing. That afternoon, we took a walk through the neighborhood. The snow was undisturbed, and the whole street looked like something out of a snow globe. Elise and Mira walked ahead, their arms linked, while Clara and I trailed behind. Clara turned to me at one point and said, You were the bridge, weren't you? I looked at her, puzzled. She smiled. Ow! Between who Elise was and who she is now. I shook my head slowly. No, she was always both. I just stayed long, enough for her to find her way back. That evening, Mira pulled her mom aside for a conversation. I stayed back in the kitchen, giving them space. Later, Elise told me Myra had apologized, not for leaving, not for the years apart, but for not realizing sooner that her mother had been broken long before she ever showed it. Elise told her it wasn't her fault, that none of us know what. Our parents are truly carrying until we've carried our own pain for a while. They didn't cry, they just held each other's hands like two women finally standing on level ground. After dinner, Claire asked Elise if she could take a few of her paintings back to the farm. She wanted to hang them in her studio to remind herself of what healing could look like on canvas. Elise agreed, and the two of them spent an hour rolling and packaging them carefully. Talking about technique and color and emotion, I watched from the doorway, marveling at how far Elise had come from isolation and silence to connection and creation. Later that night, as we all sat together in the living room, the fire crackling low, Mira turned to Elise and said, "I'm thinking of staying through New Year's, if that's okay." Elise smiled and nodded, her eyes gleaming. "Yo, you're always welcome here." Then Mira looked at me and added, "You too, Roman. You're not just part of this house anymore. You're part of this family." It was the first time she'd said that aloud. Though I'd felt it long before, hearing it made something settle deep in my chest, like a stone, finally finding its place in the foundation. On New Year's Eve, we stood outside in the backyard, watching distant fireworks shimmer over the treetops. Elise leaned against me, wrapped in her thick coat, her gloved hand tucked into mine. Mira and Clara stood a few feet away, their foreheads touching, silhouetted by bursts of color in the sky. The world felt still, suspended in possibility. Elise whispered, "1 year ago, I was afraid of everything I had locked myself into. A version of life I didn't even want to live. And now, this." I kissed her temple and said, "Now, you're free." Hey. She nodded slowly. "And I'm not afraid of the basement anymore." The basement, the very place where she once trapped. Herself in panic had become her greatest offering to the world. A space of rebirth. A classroom. A gallery. Studio where healing took form and strangers became friends. It was symbolic now of fear, but of what happens when you dare to open the locked doors inside yourself. Weeks later, after Mira and Clara had returned to the farm, Elise and I stood in that very basement, looking at the latest collection she was preparing to exhibit at the local art walk. One piece in particular caught my eye, a large canvas painted almost entirely in deep, haunting blues. In the center was a small door, just barely open, with light spilling out into the dark. I pointed at it. "That one's my favorite." Elise smiled and said, "Mine too. It's the story, isn't it?" I nodded. "Yeah, the story of a locked door and what waited on the other side." And that was the real miracle of it all. It wasn't that Elise had healed perfectly, or that everything ended in a perfect bow. It was that she had allowed herself to live fully again, to love, to hurt, to reconnect, and to be seen. That she had chosen to invite life back in, even after the door had been slammed shut so many times. And I was lucky, no, honored to have been a witness to it. To have played a part, so when people ask how it all began, I say this: it started with a favor, a quiet knock, a neighbor, basement. But it became something bigger, a story not just of fear, but of what happens when love chooses to stay, when healing chooses to begin, and when two people, no matter how broken, decide to open the door together. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.